guess I'm going to read the first chapter of my book, which is a good introduction to who I am and why this space means so much to me because of part of the journey that I've been through as an Indigenous woman. It's like the things that we have to go through and that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Not a lot of people really get to see it from our point of view, what we do, and what we have to live with. And so I'll just start with chapter 1 from my book, Thunderbird Rising. Thank you all for being here. So chapter 1, Return Home. I sit on the raised patio of my desert home, nestled in the luscious vegetation of a red rock cove. The peaceful flow of Oak Creek serenades me as I begin to record my story under the swaying branches of sycamore, cottonwood, and oak trees. A bamboo chime knocks and clanks, playing a grounding melody as the wind rocks it to and fro. Hummingbirds dive bomb their tiny bodies at each other, gracefully battling for positions before the feeder, whose nectar easily earns their company. Occasionally, an inquisitive hummer hovers back and forth before my face while flashing its iridescent hues. Perhaps it's a challenge, or it's simply curious about me. Either way, I'm totally elated by its unexpected attention. Get back here, I giggle as it hums away. Summer tanagers, thunderhawks, red-breasted mergansers, purple finches, yellow warblers, and over 40 different species of birds I've self-identified also call this cove home. Their presence brings me close to heaven. Spiny lizards run up and down the trees, hunting innumerable insects. Occasionally, I spot a tarantula and one of its only predators, the tarantula hawk, a wasp notorious for having one of the most painful stings of any venomous creature. Both remind me that I'm in the desert. My direct environment often allows me to forget this with its lush greenery, diverse species count, and constant water flow, all features of this unique desert riparian ecosystem. Grandfather rocks, the type we use in our inipi, or traditional sweat lodge, sit majestically along the creek's edge. Some are so large and evocative that I wonder if they might be dinosaur eggs. Triggered, my mind wanders back into last night's riveting dream. I feel like half of me was still there, in that place where grotesque beings attacked me with everything they had, after she told me they needed to activate my powers. She being the witch once disguised as my friend, but whose truth I discovered. I fought with them, defending, blocking, and flying in ways I never had before. Horizontally and vertically, my body zipped around, dodging their every move. A looming, swirling eye opened in the sky above me, a programming machine. I hovered horizontally beneath it, my belly facing the sky. It surged with full force, assaulting me with a barrage of negative thoughts that attempted to overtake and control my perceptive energy. But my mind proved impenetrable. As I deflected every attack, my energy and power exponentially increased. Suddenly, a tall and powerful shapeshifter lunged at my throat and clenched it before I had a chance to escape. His tightening hands fired electricity throughout my entire body, tasering me. But I concentrated the energy and shot it out of me into the sky above us as lightning. Thunder exploded all around us. He surged into me a second time. I isolated his energy again, transformed it into lightning, and deflected it from my body into the earth. Thunder boomed, pulsating the earth in waves. Simultaneously, a loud thump outside of my dream awakened me, leaving the unfinished fight replaying through my groggy minds. I sat up lazily, switched on the lamp, and sloppily recorded my dream with one eye open, the only one awake, and added it to the pages of the filling book of my visions, each displaying the journey of my progress through the worlds I visited while my body fitfully slept. Dreams like this dominated my psyche at the time that I began this book. I was living in Sedona, Arizona, which is known for being one of the largest New Age spiritual communities in the world. Spiritual practitioners of all modalities live and gather there. I hadn't heard of Sedona until 2 months before I first visited, but was close to it 10 years before, when I attended the Return of the Ancestors gathering that was held just a half-hour away in Cottonwood. After this gathering, I drove through miles and miles of the desert surrounding Sedona, eventually pausing to explore a particularly intriguing path. I climbed out of my car, stepped a few yards down the trail, and approached a tree standing proudly before me with a perfect circular opening in its trunk. Heeding the impulse to look inside, I discovered it was the home of an extraordinary, unused, red clay pipe with a spiral inscribed onto it, much like the spiral that is now tattooed upon my forehead. I traded evenly for that special pipe and have carried it with me to this day. Other than this remarkable visit years ago, Arizona and I seem to have nothing in common. Yet in November of 2018, I felt a strong urge to go to Sedona and answered that calling a few months later. Before my arrival, I'd been touring for 4 months in a zigzagging loop from Standing Rock, North Dakota to the Southwest, and finally through the entire state of California, specifically to anchor traditionally handpoke tattoos. In that 4-month period, I tattooed over 100 clients, a huge task considering that my method, like all machine-free artistries, requires at least twice the work output and time to complete. Welcome, come in. Hello, welcome. So it was an auspicious and empowering journey, but also extremely demanding. Make yourselves at home, we're just doing a routine. I put my self-care to the side to just barely meet the needs of my son, my clients, and myself during the tour. I was sapped. I realized that I couldn't maintain life on the road as a single mom while taking on such intense energy work. For the first time in years, I sought a diversion from the nomadic lifestyle, a place to recharge and a steady home base where my clients instead came to me. Being in any city felt like being trapped in the matrix, and my usual home in Northern California had become increasingly dangerous as devastating wildfires began to cripple forests, air quality, travel, and entire cities. When coupled with erratic periods of droughts and floods, California living had become quite risky. Furthermore, recurring dreams of the coming coastal tsunamis burned in the back of my mind. The threats far outweighed the familiarity. It was time to leave for good. Thus, when I drove into Sedona for the first time on a drizzling January day, I was blown away by the intense beauty of her red striated mountains and cliffs in stark contrast to the barren and seemingly endless desert that surrounded her. Resembling some exotic temple of the gods taken from a faraway land and dropped into this high desert, this obviously holy land felt like a once hidden rejuvenation oasis whose secret had long since been revealed. I pulled the car over and knelt upon the red rock ground immediately after crossing her boundaries. My entire body shook and vibrated as the energy of this land coursed through my veins like lightning. I must have sat there trembling for an entire 20 minutes before I could finally gather enough composure to crawl back into the car and pull out my tobacco. I introduced myself, my son, and our lineage, and I laid my tobacco down as an offering upon Mother Earth, in respects and gratitudes to the caretakers who had inhabited this land long before it carried the Sedona name. I later discovered that this moment was my return home. I've lived a few places in my life that I will always consider home. During my first week there, I split my time between hand-poking tattoos on my clients and climbing up vortexes with my son. A vortex is a concentrated energy center, like a tornado. But instead of energy visualizing in tornadic form, it's invisible and flows up and down from both the ground and sky. I loved the energy of the land, but couldn't stand the slow-moving swarms of tourists along with the Native American art and spirituality that were sold everywhere I looked. In these days, when nature is rapidly converted to concrete and thus a spiritual connection to the land is difficult to maintain, it's reasonable that tourists would flock to a place like Sedona to enjoy such incredibly rare beauty, and that most of them would seek out a spiritual experience to match it while there. The problem is, how does one know who is genuine in a place filled with self-proclaimed healers, shamans, and gurus? And how does one know what is real in a place where white-owned stores sell supposedly authentic Native American art and spiritual items for a hefty price without the presence of the Native American people themselves? I expressed my desire to move to Sedona and was told that I shouldn't because only white people lived there. Yet in this place that only white people lived, I saw an enormous amount of Native American ceremonies, arts, ideas, and teachings for sale by and to anyone other than those to whom it traditionally and genetically belonged. This is cultural appropriation, defined by the Oxford Dictionary as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, etc. of one people or society by members of another and typically more dominant people or society. Those who are subjected to it know all too well that it's a much nicer way of describing or even concealing cultural genocide. The invisible continuation of the physical genocide of the entire Native American population that began in 1492 and which continues to this day in the form of the theft of, misrepresentation of, and removal of the customs, cultures, and traditions of those same peoples. Regardless of the grief and anger I felt when observing the widespread cultural appropriation in Sedona, my connection to the land proved more powerful. So I set my intention on making it my home despite its issues which did eventually cause me to leave after taking a year to complete this book. Sedona has a notorious history of Native American ceremonies being held for profit by people who lack the proper training and ancestral connection to do so. As a result, those who don't know any better might pay a hefty and unexpected price. In 2009, New Age guru James Arthur Ray ran an imitation sweat lodge at his New Age warrior retreat in Sedona, purporting himself as a shaman and the experience as an authentic Native American purification ceremony. It enabled him to swindle $10,000 from each participant. However, the lodge was completely lined with plastic, which produced a deadly amount of heat and steam once the purification began. His self-proclaimed shamanic knowledge cooked 2 of the participants to death inside the misconstructed lodge and sickened 19 others, one of whom later died after a 10-day coma. Excuse me. None of the participants, lodge leaders, nor the mock sweat lodge itself were actually Native American. This example of cultural appropriation proves how dangerous it can be for someone who wasn't taught the proper protocol to conduct ceremonies that do not belong to them. It is also offensively marginalizing to the tribal people from whom the ceremony originates, for a self-proclaimed shaman to place themselves into the ceremonial leader position, and furthermore to collect an exuberant fee to do so. This type of shaman or guru is no more than a thief and a liar who preys on both the Native American people and culture and those to whom he or she sells the ceremony. Hold on. So, spirit has a way of revealing the truth, and often this way is very harsh and revealing, as seen in the case of those who died in James Arthur Ray's fake sweat lodge. One must learn to exercise caution when entering any ceremony or purchasing any item that is labeled as authentic, especially when labeled in a Native American package. Often you aren't getting what it claims, especially in a place like Sedona, where almost all its indigenous people were forcefully removed. It can be quite easy to get taken advantage of and unintentionally contribute to cultural appropriation, or in more truthful terms, cultural genocide. Meanwhile, the final night of my initial visit to Sedona ended with a bang. My youngest son, Zeke, and I stayed atop the airport mesa, in the swirl of its vortex. Beneath a crisp, star-filled sky, I observed the blood wolf moon eclipse, the intriguing effect created when our planet passes in front of the moon and the sun and blocks the light of the sun from reaching the moon. This impact turns the moon coppery red as it is slowly swallowed by the Earth's shadow. I rested in gratitude after watching. That night, I dreamt that I purged and spilled out my guts while everyone around me laughed. Yet, I didn't feel embarrassed. Someone whispered to me, "You're like Lucille Ball now." And then I woke up. I processed this puzzling dream and soon realized that Lucille Ball was a revolutionary woman in her field. The comedic star of I Love Lucy, she brought the gift of laughter to a wide audience. People loved her because she gave them joy in challenging times. She was beautiful, but it wasn't her beauty that made her. It was her ability to make everyone laugh, and thus to raise the frequency through lightening their hearts, a significant form of healing. Her fearlessness paved the way for future women in both comedy and in Hollywood. Her on-screen marriage with real-life husband Desi Arnaz, who played Rick, became the first multi-ethnic relationship to air on television. Lucille refused to do the show if her husband wasn't given the lead role as her on-screen husband. Thus, the first public multiracial relationship became normalized in the 1950s, in a time when discrimination and separation based on skin color were still considered publicly acceptable. Thankful for the insights, I transcribed the dream into my journal, foreshadowing the time I'd live in Sedona, where I'd have the peaceful space I needed to finally tell my story through this book, or to purge my past, like my dream, in a healthy manner that would hopefully lighten others' hearts in a Lucille Ball sort of way. After all, dreams do give us good paths to follow. As we left town the next day, I stopped on instinct at a local arts center. The ladies behind the counter looked up as my son and I entered, but neither acknowledged us. It didn't really matter to me at first. I asked one of the ladies if I could take pictures. She looked up and said yes, very briskly, and then looked away with a scowl on her face. As we walked away, I heard the women cheerily thank a man for coming in and wish him a lovely good day. I was surprised by their joy at his presence, and I laughed a bit to myself, but I didn't focus on it. I searched the gallery for inspirational beauty, but found cultural appropriation instead. At least half of their prices of their pieces were high-priced portraits or sculptures of Native American people. A new couple walked in. They were happily greeted. "Welcome to the Arts Center." I noted the differences between us: colors, features, tattoos, and perception. Instantly, I understood why I was drawn to go there. My son and I, living representations of Native America, were snubbed and judged by others that got paid to literally sell our people and culture. Instantly infuriated, I wanted to confront them both. Instead, I gave them another chance. I stopped in the middle of the gallery and obviously stared at them. I wondered if we were really that invisible. Did we only exist in the portraits and sculptures of our ancestors? And did the jewelry made by invisible Native artists only get so much exposure because of the dollar sign that could be attached to it? Did we only matter when we could be authentically sold for $10,000? I stared at them as they hustled cheerily about with their European clients, answering questions with certainty and joyously sharing smiles. I stared while they refused to stare back. I watched as one of the women walked right past us, looked at my beautiful boy, and visually checked his hands. She saw nothing, so she looked up with her nose in the air and scuffled away, once again refusing to look me in the eye. I seized that opportunity to explain to my son in a steady but clearly audible tone. My son, this is what some of this world has come to. They glorify our ancestors to sell their image, while we, the ones that are still here, the ones that survived what they did to our ancestors, stand right before them and are ignored as if we are worthless. Not even a hello are we given. They want to use our culture and image to line their pockets, but they don't want us. I'm sick of it. This is going to change. I snapped pictures of the Native-inspired pieces in the gallery along with their prices, some of which were as steep as $10,000. And instead of raising my voice to these ladies, I chose to bring awareness of this issue, cultural appropriation, to a platform that could reach and teach thousands. The post appeared on my social media outlets the next day and reached as many as I hoped. So in this way, I left Sedona with a mixture of love and resentment swirling within me. The land called me home in a way that I'd only felt in a few other places. Yet the cultural appropriation I witnessed brought up unresolved issues within me. Cultural appropriation is rooted in the Native American genocide that began with the arrival of Christopher Columbus to our homelands. The truth of Columbus's actions toward the Native peoples he encountered are often left out in school lessons and are far from common knowledge. He is celebrated as the one who discovered America, especially on this day, which is now thankfully being turned into Indigenous Peoples Day. But for many years, this has been known as Columbus Day. So he is celebrated in that way. Yet he is truly only the one who opened the door to his colonization via the authority of the doctrine of discovery, at the brutal expense of the thousands of Native American tribes that already lived here. The doctrine of discovery, particularly its 1493 papal decree, attempted to politically, legally, and spiritually justify Christian Europeans' claims to lands and waterways found while exploring new lands. Even if already inhabited, land could be termed as newly discovered and therefore claimable if a flag were planted in its soil in the name of a Christian European monarch. Furthermore, if the people who already lived there insisted on their right to the land, that being the Indigenous people, those who discovered it by putting a flag in the soil could claim that those Indigenous people weren't living on the land according to European Christian standards, thus resulting in their acceptable extermination, imprisonment, and assimilation, along with the seizure and possession of their lands. The doctrine of discovery has been used against the Indigenous peoples of America, Africa, New Zealand, Asia, and Australia in the name of ruthless Christian European land pursuits. A monk who traveled with Columbus, Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote a book called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, describing his first-hand experience of the first contact with Indian tribes. Hey, my son, can you please bring me a little water? It's there in my cup. So, Bartolomé described the natives as Indios, meaning they were with God. Thank you. Take a little break. So meaning they were with God. Thus, how the description of Indian came to describe Native people. Much better. It was a compliment from this man who became known as the first Indian advocate because he refused to take Native slaves as Columbus implored him to, and instead presented compelling evidence to King Charles V of the atrocious acts committed against the Native people. However, his voice alone was not enough to stop the destruction heading to the shores of Great Turtle Island, the original name for America. As more Europeans arrived on the shores of America, laws backed by the doctrine of discovery were put into effect that legalized the murder of any Indian considered to be a threat to the settlement of the land, be it man, woman, or child. Often the threat was simply their existence. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 pushed nearly all the southeastern tribes west of the Mississippi River, and eventually further constrained them, opening their fertile land to the unchecked colonization of settlers, and eventually to the slavery of thousands of Native Americans and millions of Africans via the cotton industry. To end the ruthless slaughter of their people and make peace with settlers, countless tribal leaders were forced, under duress, to sign over 500 treaties that were drafted by the U.S. government alone. However, not a single treaty has been honored to this day, even though it's written in federal law that treaties are the supreme law of the land. The push to honor the treaties has become an important issue amongst modern-day Native American activists. The physical genocide of our people faded only after millions died, roughly 90% of the entire population. Any tribes that weren't wiped out by famine, Any tribes that weren't wiped out by famine, war, or the diseases introduced by colonizers were forced onto Indian reservations, lands deemed unsuitable or undesirable for settlers. The buffalo that once numbered into the millions, and upon whom numerous tribes relied upon almost entirely for sustenance and shelter, were slaughtered by settlers and left to rot on the range in the hopes that they'd eventually be driven to extinction, and along with them, the nations that depended on them. So what I have here is a picture. If you can see it, that is a picture that shows a mound of buffalo skulls that they collected when they targeted the buffalo. So that's all buffalo skulls there. And all of those bodies of those buffaloes were just left to rot, which is the opposite of the way that we do things, which is we use every part of every animal we hunt. And so, Native American children were then forcibly removed from their parents and placed in boarding schools. Their hair was brutally cut, traditional clothing and names permanently removed, and traditional teaching strictly forbidden. In this extremely traumatic manner, these young children came under the control of Christian missionaries and or military personnel who severely beat them and punished them if they spoke their native language, practiced their traditional culture and spirituality, or acted in any way deemed Indian or savage. Everything these children knew and loved was removed and replaced with an Anglo-American, supposedly superior substitute, designed to kill the Indian in him and save the man. These words, delivered in a speech by U.S. Cavalry Captain Richard Henry Pratt during the opening of the first off-reservation boarding school in 1879, the Carlisle Indian School, reflected the sentiments of the U.S. government's approach towards the forced assimilation of Native peoples. The bodies of little Indian children are only beginning to be exhumed from their graves underneath these boarding schools, revealing the truth of the horrific conditions these children endured. Recounts of severe physical, sexual, mental, and emotional abuse are just beginning to emerge from boarding school survivors who are bravely coming forward to share their stories. Native American parents did not gain the right to refuse to send their children to boarding schools until the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which still has loopholes that allow many Native children to fall through to this day. Even my father and my grandmother went to boarding schools. In my family, my generation was the first to not attend. However, I don't feel that my upbringing was far removed from the boarding school environment at all. It remained illegal for Native peoples to practice our ceremonies until 1978, with the enactment of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was passed just 4 years before I was born. In other words, for half of my father's life, for most of my grandparents' life, and for all of my great-grandparents' lives, they could be imprisoned and severely punished for participating in a sweat lodge ceremony, attending Sundance, or for even burning sage and praying in their native tongue. All ceremonies are spiritual practices which today are freely practiced by groups of people like James Arthur Ray, who lack the understanding, proper protocol, or genetic connection to fairly do so. Their actions marginalize the original teachings of the culture from which the practices originate, spread massive misinformation about the meaning behind these ceremonies, and make an outright mockery of a sacred way of life that has only recently been returned legally to its people who have already endured so much. Thus, when I visited uptown Sedona, filled to its maximum with bustling tourists from around the world, and I passed by an authentic Native American art store with Lakota-style headdresses for sale, I couldn't help but feel anger, resentment, and sadness. I felt alienation in looking at the poorly made imitation art of a ceremonial item that, when traditionally made, is bestowed upon a chief who has earned, over a lifetime, the right to wear it. Every eagle feather of his headdress tells the story of his path, of an honor bestowed, and of his long and humble journey as the warrior of the people that he truly was. It was never bought nor sold, but was bequeathed and worn only on special occasions. Yet, here was its replica hanging in the store with an authentic label, misinforming those who didn't know, nearly everyone, that these headdresses are apparently made from turkey feathers, that they can be worn by man or woman, and most deplorably can be bought or sold. I looked upon the thousands of people who took in this imitation art with its authentic label stamped above its pricey sales tag, combined with a flat-out lie of a sales pitch about its legitimacy recited by a store worker. And I shuddered as I remembered how much our people have struggled to remain alive and to preserve our traditions. Take a drink here. I stood there as a survivor after generations of genocide, looking upon the mockery and sale of our traditions, and I realized the magnitude and insanity of the cultural genocide we still endure. After leaving Sedona, I spent a month in New Mexico to film an episode I'm featured in with Indigenous, a 13-part documentary television series that explores Indigenous tattoo traditions around the world. It was the first opportunity I've been given to share information about the traditional customs, tattoo customs of my bands, the Dakota and Lakota Sioux, to such a large audience. Our first day of filming featured Bo, aka riding Thunderbolt, a tamed white buffalo. We hoped would be the visual centerpiece behind the scene where I shared the prophecy of White Buffalo Woman. I wondered how it was possible to tame a buffalo, especially a bull. I didn't like where my imagination led me. As we pulled into the Lamont farm, Bo was the first sight to greet us. The entire fenced portion of the front yard was reserved for him, and his looming body stood alone in it, an unlikely scene for such an incredibly wakan or sacred animal. His handler enthusiastically came out to greet us. After exchanging the basics, I informed him that I'd rather allow Bo to roam in and out of the scenes as he pleased, rather than being handled or forced to participate. I asked him if he could remove the halter from Bo's face. He did, and I saw that Bo was completely bald beneath the halter, which is an indication that it was almost never removed. We planned out the scenes and began filming. It went well until Monty, who is Bo's handler, interrupted us to tell us that he was about to head out and had something we were really going to want to see. So we stopped shooting and followed him. He opened the door to a large trailer, and within it stood an enormous taxidermy black buffalo bull. Rendered speechless, we uncomfortably reached for something to say. Wow, was all any of us could muster. He attempted to sell it to us or anyone we knew, and then left. We returned to our set, now confused and a bit angry. I'd given the benefit of the doubt to this man as a keeper of a white buffalo. But now I saw major red flags of yet another case of cultural appropriation in which our sacred buffalo were used to fill this man's pockets. We returned to filming, but were again interrupted, this time by his wife, Lana. "Okay, kids, time's up, I'm leaving." We looked at each other in shock as her husband had just told us we had all afternoon to finish our set. We reminded her of this and told her we only needed about another hour to finish, but she insisted that we leave immediately. So reluctantly, we agreed. As I gathered my things and my child into the car, she pulled hastily out of her garage and nearly backed into us. She didn't apologize, but remained inches away from my car, with her brake lights on, and I was certain once again of their cultural appropriation and exploitation of an animal they knew was sacred to our people because it represented the fulfillment of a prophecy connected to our entire ceremonial culture and history. Disgusted by them both, I promised Bo, which let me show you his picture. This is Bo. And you can see in the picture that he's got the halter imprint, on his face. So he's very sacred to our people. He represents the ceremony, our entire ceremonial ways. So I promised him, Bo, that I'd share his story. So the director of the episode of this Indigenous episode that I'm in told me later that she had to go back and forth with Lana in emails to settle on a price to rent Bo out for the shoot. Lana kept insisting that their offers were too low and demanded more and more. In the end, she wasn't satisfied with the final offer but accepted it. Hence why she must have felt entitled to kick us out hours earlier than we expected. After completing the documentary in New Mexico, my son and I returned to Sedona to find our home. A beautiful, serene spot opened up for us after a long week of searching, and we finally moved into our own place for the first time in 3 years. My Ojibwe spiritual brother, who'd been a mentor of mine for over 10 years, messaged to congratulate me and to warn me about the New Agers and to share some vital information with me. Sedona has been a ceremonial gathering space of Native peoples for many generations. Even my bands, the Lakota and Dakota, traveled to Sedona for ceremony. Furthermore, the land was considered so holy that the warriors left their weapons far outside of the ceremonial space before entering. Sedona has been known as the place of healing by Native peoples far before it was inhabited and overrun by New Age gurus like James Arthur Ray. Long before outsiders bastardized our ceremonies and misused them for profit, we'd been coming to that sacred land for ceremony, which was not contained within a single purchased experience or weekend retreat, but was and remains a beautiful way of life filled with sacrifice and responsibility that strengthened our relationship with Mother Earth. I realized that I had a direct ancestral connection to Sedona through the prayers and energy my ancestors left behind. It was my own ancestors then who must have led me there and encouraged me to include it amongst the few places I've considered home. So Sedona is most recently Yavapai territory, and before that was home to the Sinagua people, who mysteriously vanished. Now, while the Sinagua people might have left by choice, the Yavapai were forcibly removed from Sedona in the late 1880s and subjected to the same physical and cultural genocide all Native Americans have endured. Forced to relocate from the homelands they lived upon for generations, the Yavapai were moved to a foreign land and held as prisoners within reservations. Their absence made it easy for settlers and gold miners to colonize Sedona. The permanent presence of the Yavapai is mostly gone in Sedona, except for the few local inhabitants and visitors who are descendants. Yet, just like the presence of my ancestors, their spiritual existence remains imprinted upon the land to which they still belong. We believe that we do not own the lands, but instead belong to it, creating a bond that cannot be broken, even by generations of forced physical separation. I didn't forget this when I looked around my home in gratitude and left offerings to the land. But I noticed who did as I observed the $1 million, hold on just a moment. As I observed the $1 million Sedona mansions reserved for the elite, or when I gawked at the exuberantly high prices of everything there, especially anything Native American. I laughed when I heard that a local tattooist attempted to patent vortex dirt tattoos as his original idea. When Native peoples from the Dakota Sioux to the Yavapai have been using the red dirt from Sedona and similar areas in their traditional tattoos and paints for countless generations before this guy supposedly discovered and created it. The disconnection was most obvious as I spotted tourists and locals alike hiking on Bell Rock, a sacred site to the Yavapai, who don't walk on it outside of ceremony because of their deep respect and understanding of its power. There were many such distasteful experiences I endured every time I ventured outside of my home while there, like microaggressions that piled up on me, and for this reason I chose to mostly stay home, finding peace in the solitary hideaway created by the trees, birds, creatures, and running creek in my backyard, who were also coincidentally dealing with the effects of encroaching settlement, industry, and pollution that threatened their future survival. We had much in common, and that space became the place where I channeled my thoughts and experiences into this book, in the hopes that it would make a difference in such matters, if not in my lifetime, then in that of my children and the generations to come. For these reasons, my time in Sedona became extremely bittersweet. At the center of my observations, which have culminated over my entire life, I see that misinformation and separation prevail amongst the masses. I see blissful ignorance and greed overtaking the majority. True sacred connection and ceremony have been replaced with disconnection, instant gratification, and inauthentic spirituality, which result in a blatant disregard for Mother Earth and her creatures. I pray that this world will change, that the truth will finally be revealed, and that the true caretakers of the land will rise again into positions of positive leadership and environmental stewardship. In fact, I foresee it through the prophecies our ancestors left behind for us to fulfill, and whose omens are already showing. I must admit that I went to Sedona filled with expectations for my new life. I thought that I'd have numerous clients for handpoke tattoos, and instead my client level went from entirely booked when I traveled to my clients to an average of 5 a month when they instead had to come to me, giving me the space and time I needed to recharge. I expected to join with the man I thought would be my partner, but instead remained single, giving me the time to clear my energy. I expected to be involved with the local community, but instead stayed home and felt quite agitated when I did venture into the crowds. I had to realize my ancestors were protecting me. Everything I imagined Sedona to be proved untrue, except for the serenity I found in seclusion and nature and in the stability I knew it would give to us. On May 13, 2019, I took my boy to a community park. While he played with other kids, I basked alone in the sun. When his friends left, he came over and soon became captivated by a caterpillar that fell at our feet. I bent down to inspect its unusual markings and then stood back up to put it back in the tree. As I lifted my arm, my vision blackened, my arms and chest tingled, and my body shook as I swooned uncontrollably. I wondered if this spell, the worst yet, would be the one where I'd finally pass out. But after a few minutes, it passed, so I told my boy, it's time to go, we must need to eat. So we ate, relaxed, and after a while, I put him to bed. I settled in too, but soon received extremely troubling news. My spiritual brother, Ra Tamati, passed on a few hours earlier. Around the same time, I blacked out at the park. I was devastated to hear it. He was the sort of person that lit up any room with his joy, and now, just like that, he was gone. I cried, tossed, and turned throughout the rest of the night. The next morning, I found out that he'd taken his own life. Ra's larger-than-life energy, positive attitude, and Maori-based spiritual therapy practice made a powerful impact. Thus why his suicide was unexpected and especially disturbing to his friends and family. His tragic passing brought up my own experiences from the depths. I found myself questioning my take on life. Was there something I could have done to help him? Why couldn't he overcome? What hurt him so badly that he was driven to end his life so despondently? I wept often, remembering what it's like to be in that state, where it seems the only way to end the pain is to take your own life. I felt horrible, knowing that he was lost in that agony just before his death. I cried for him and for all of us who felt that way, and more than anything, I understood. Later that afternoon, I left the house to divert the focus on my loss of my friend, but it didn't work. I still broke out in tears. On the way back, a man tailgated me incessantly, and as I slowed to pull into the driveway, he honked rudely and almost drove his car into mine. I snapped, calmly threw the car and parked, hurled the door open gracefully, took an Inigo Montoya stance, and I declared to my new mortal enemy, "Hello, my name is Stephanie. You killed any fucks I have left. Prepare to die." I didn't care that he was a man and I a woman as I challenged him to a duel. He was going down. But instead, he inched around me and sped off, leaving me in my frustration with no relief. As I again broke down, I analyzed the separation. People commonly spill their hatred onto others. Compassion for others is mostly for show, rather than a constant state of mindful action as it ought to be. The man that attacked me from the safety of his car didn't care if a young child was in the car, nor if the person in front of him was just barely holding it together while doing their best to survive an extremely difficult day. He only cared about getting 2 minutes faster to his destination, so he pushed and shoved the entire way. His actions helped me understand that Ra probably reached his own limit of others' insane behavior that day. I finally composed myself enough to go back inside. Heading directly to the solitude of my backyard, I sprawled on the deck and I cried, praying for help. I've been in this place often, driven into a deep depression because of the chaos and insanity in our world, the effect it has on me and my loved ones, and the havoc it reaps upon the earth. I felt sick to my stomach, and for a moment I found myself imagining death once again. But my thoughts always returned to my sons. I'd never willingly leave them to face this world alone. I had to carry on for their sake. Hours passed in this way until I watched an inspirational movie to remind myself of our connection and purpose. It finally dried my tears and reminded me that there's always a light at the end of even the darkest tunnels. Furthermore, in our most tumultuous moments, we build the strength that awakens our highest potential. I was reminded that the power of forgiveness is forgiving. And that first, I needed to give myself compassion and take it easy. I prayed before going to sleep, picturing everyone in my life that hurt me and offered them my forgiveness. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I let go of any expectations and desires that I had as a need in order to fill the void within my heart. Voids which are given to humanity through the programming machines of society that lead us to believe that we aren't enough. I reached into the negative programming of my childhood and filled it with love. I touched those moments where I'd nearly taken my own life, and I stood above myself, showering myself with compassion and encouragement, and then I finally fell asleep. I slept peacefully for the first time in months and woke with a dire need to share my thoughts on suicide. How would I share? With a social media post? No, not enough. A video? Again, no. And then I realized it was time to write my book, to share my story, which is filled with darkness, tragedy, empowerment, and resilience. For years, I didn't want to remember. Unfortunately, it took me losing another loved one to suicide to finally find the courage to transform my pain into this survival story. So, here, I share the ways that kept me going, like a thunderbird rising, despite wanting to take my life when sadness and grief overcame me. I detail how I found safety and serenity in miraculous ways. I explain my understanding that a common thread exists between all people, despite the chaos and insanity that seems to prevail. It is up to each of us to go within and uncover the truth of who we really are and what we came here to do. Once we come to truly know ourselves, we can begin to break down the illusion of separation that allows us to hurt ourselves and one another. Then accept the responsibility of mending our broken relationships with each other and with our Mother Earth.